our fourth session on risk management and assessment. I'm Jen Plowden. I am at the Land Trust Alliance, and we're really pleased that you could join us tonight for this session. Thanks so much to CLCC and to Connie for being here tonight, and also to the PCLB Foundation, who supports this work. Let's see, I know that Connie has a really great program and workshop for you tonight with lots of opportunities for questions. So I think, we heard you on our last session. I know that that's something that is important for all of you, and we've created space for that tonight. And I'm gonna just hand it right over to Connie to kick us off talking about stewardship and programs. So with that, go ahead, Connie.
Great, thanks, Jen. So at this point, I think you know me, but just, again, if it hasn't come through, I am a consultant for the Land Trust Alliance and for CLCC and others, particularly in the areas of organizational capacity building and land trust accreditation. But I also work at the Kent Land Trust as its executive director. So I struggle with boots on the ground for these day-to-day issues that we'll be talking about. This is not just, coming at you from the comfortable remove of the consultant, but of somebody who has to try it out in real life. So thank you once again for signing in for what I call our Hour of Power, a tour through risk management. And today we'll talk about stewardship and programs. Your time invested here really pays off in terms of your ability to identify and prevent downside risks, as well as position yourselves for positive outcomes. So we'll just spend a quick moment with the risk management vocabulary, and you'll recognize these slides. So again, just a quick review to remind ourselves of how we're defining risk as both the threat or opportunity, the possibility that a future event or action might end up different from what we expect, adversely or beneficially impacting our mission. And any situation, of course, where the outcome is not a certainty involves a level of risk, and risk management is a discipline for addressing that uncertainty. Risk management strategies are used to reduce the likelihood of experiencing a negative outcome and positioning the organization to take advantage of opportunities. So we learned that there are three dimensions to help quantify and analyze risk, and those are likelihood, that a given outcome could be more or less likely or happen more or less frequently, magnitude, that the impact of the outcome could be small or could be really life-changing for the organization, and directional, that outcomes could be good or bad. And then you'll recognize this rubric showing that the likelihood and the magnitude together help guide our investment and actions to influence the outcomes. So category A risks are high likelihood, high impact, areas where we want to focus the most energy and resources. We're going to want to take action here to reduce the likelihood, reduce the impact, or both, and maybe also offset some of the financial and reputational costs in the event that the outcome happens. Category B risks deserve focus due to their impact, but they may never come to pass. So here it's probably going to make more sense to engage in some risk financing like insurance or risk displacement, working with another organization who can assume the risks. Category C risks are highly likely, but not catastrophic. And here it makes sense to figure out what actions are within our own control to deal with the impact or control the likelihood. Whereas focusing overly much on category D risks might be a distraction for our organization. Okay, we're going to get right into it and talk about stewardship for probably the next half an hour or so. And we tend to think of stewardship actually in land trust as like the next thing, right? Like first we protect land and then stewardship is like next or secondary, almost like it's secondary to our mission of protecting property. But it's actually the other way around, right? we protect property in order to take care of it forever, right? We don't want to lose the property to development, but more importantly, we've protected it because it has conservation value. So we want its condition to improve or at least be unchanged, but never to deteriorate. So really, stewardship is arguably the most significant part of our missions. What risk management strategies do we use to make sure that we're protecting the conservation resources on our property? Number one, assessing stewardship needs, and this happens during project planning and on an ongoing basis. And we'll talk more through all of these different subjects, but I just want to introduce them. So assessing stewardship needs really means knowing about the conservation values that are on the land and employing the resources needed in order to protect them. Relatedly, we must stay up to date with best practices and developments in stewardship and land management. And that is probably going to take money. So the third area of stewardship that we'll talk about, and we're really going to talk about this first, is putting away reserves for defense and contingencies. And then finally, we need to know what's going on with the land. So the last subject matter that we'll visit is monitoring, as well as making sure that you have what you need in order to do a good job with monitoring. So we'll talk about BDRs, baseline documentation reports, management plans, and then we'll talk about monitoring funds and monitoring programs. Sorry. All right, so while considering a project, and definitely before closing, it makes sense to think about prospective stewardship responsibilities. And we talked about this a bit last week during the land transaction session. So knowing what you might need to do helps you consider what you might need to spend. For both easements and fee properties, there might be initial startup or one-time expenses, and there will always be future expenses for monitoring, for management, for dealing with issues of enforcement, or needing management, so problems with the management of your fee properties. So for fee properties, right, startup might include an ecological assessment, might include preparation of the first management plan, marking boundaries, signage, kiosks. If there's going to be a trail, there might be installation, there might be creation of parking lots and other infrastructure. Especially for public access properties, there might be additional signage. You might have habitat restoration as one of your initial and startup needs on a fee property, invasives treatment, native plantings, streamside buffer work, garbage cleanup. The list goes on and on, depending on the conservation values that are unique to that property and your intended use for the property. And for easements, startup might include things like marking boundaries, preparing a baseline documentation report, working with the landowner to assess the conservation needs, or making connections for the landowner to best care for their property. And in addition to all these needs that are really connected with the startup, with your assumption of responsibility, there are all these prospective costs that are associated with defending the property. The Legal Defense Reserves Calculator is an excellent tool for exploring the potential magnitude of your organization's financial exposure in connection with property defense. And here we're talking about easement enforcement claims or claims against title for your fee properties, as opposed to claims for personal injury or property damage, which are all covered under your general liability insurance. So the defense calculator uses actuarial data analogous to an organization situation, right? So they're going to look, for example, at the state that you operate in, the size and makeup of your property portfolio, whether your properties are rural or urban, your past history of claims, all of these different data points that have proven to be probative in predicting potential defense costs that you might incur. I should mention that you can get to the Legal Defense Reserves Calculator through the Terra Firma Defense Insurance Program website, and so that's where this screen capture came from. And you can also access it on the Land Trust Alliance's Learning Center. Anyway, all of those actuarial data points are used to make a recommendation that is unique to your organization's portfolio and attributes for the minimum financial reserves that might be needed to protect your conserved properties. And while specific to the organization, I can tell you that it's never an insignificant amount, right? So prior to the creation of this defense calculator, prior to the creation of terra firma conservation defense insurance, which is really what provides the data that makes this tool so rich, the standard thinking was that about $50,000 was needed as a base minimum for land trusts that had anywhere from 1 to 15 easements, and then more was needed for every additional easement. And there really wasn't a good way of predicting, what might be needed for fee property defense. So the calculator is much, much better, but I can give you the preview that you're not likely to come up with a number that is under $50,000. Land trusts with conservation defense insurance through terra firma, by the way, have a lower defense calculation, but the need for defense reserves cannot be fully mitigated by the purchase of insurance. And so it really is important to make sure that you set aside stewardship defense reserves. And there is no parallel tool for calculating future non-defense stewardship needs, such as monitoring and management. And these are so much more specific to the properties that it's best to do this analysis for your organization independently, based on your best guesses and informed by your actual expenses for monitoring and management going forward. So there's really no getting around the fact that stewarding our properties in perpetuity will require substantial resources, likely more and more as time goes on. So while many organizations have funding that is restricted for stewardship purposes, donor restricted that is, it's just as common for boards to designate certain funds as reserves for stewardship, which can be done by resolution and vote, and are recognized thereafter within your internal accountings as set aside for that purpose, but without the same obligations to a donor as those for donor restricted funds. And boards can undesignate board designated funds if other urgent needs arise. It also doesn't matter where you get these reserves from. Stewardship reserves are an essential part of every project budget, but there's a common misconception that the stewardship reserve must be a contribution from a property donor. And indeed, that is a common practice. That is a successful way of raising stewardship reserves, is to ask your donor, particularly of a conservation easement or a fee property where the donor is receiving a substantial tax benefit for that contribution. But the misconception is that the Accreditation Commission and standards and practices require that to come from a property donor, and really it could come from a fundraising campaign, it could come from operating surplus, it could come from other reserves or other donors, just as long as the addition to reserves is made. So having been through stewardship planning and reserve building, I have our first poll. Rebecca, if you would pull that up. And hopefully I'll see. Okay, yeah. So the first poll is which of these risk management strategies are you using to be prepared for current and future stewardship needs? And we'll give a few seconds for people to vote. I think you can choose as many as apply. Just over 50% weighing in. We'll give it a minute or two more. I'm glad to see that people are tracking their stewardship expenses year over year. With fewer doing the legal defense insurance or the legal defense calculator. So maybe something to check out when you have time to see what it comes up with for your organization. All right, let's stop sharing. And I just wanted to take a couple of minutes for questions about this first place, for this first subject area. And you can come off mute or raise your hands, however that is best. No one, any questions?
Connie, this is Vic Herson. I have a question. You seem to focus on easements. Was that intentionally, or does this refer also to to properties that are owned?
It refers to both your fee properties and your easements, but the issues are a little bit different. So, in terms of defending your easements, you're more likely to be litigating encroachments or violations of the easement terms. And with respect to your fee properties, you would be more likely to be defending against a title claim or trying to enforce on a trespass issue. And so, the issues are a little bit different. The way that it plays out is a little bit different, but you would have expenses either way.
Thank you.
Scott.
Our board is toying with the idea of an annual spending rule of X% of our endowment as a maximum contribution to our budget. Should we, and we board designate our defense calculator number. It's just board designated. So when we calculate our annual contribution from the endowment to our budget based on our spending rule, which presently is either 3% or maybe 3.5%. Is it necessary for us to exclude the budget, the board designated pot, or can that be included since it's board designated and could in an emergency be used for something else?
For the purpose of calculating the amount to come, using the spending rule calculation, I think that you could include the designated funds. The designated funds are, they are there as a placeholder in case you need to draw upon them. And so, it's a moving situation where, if you needed 1 year to draw upon your pot of board designated funds and you spend it down by $50,000 to $100,000 on a litigation, you need to build that back up eventually, at least for an accredited land trust. So I don't really know that it makes a difference if you wanted to include it for your spending rule, so long as that pot is there in case you need it, and if you do need it, so long as you replenish it. Does that answer your question?
It does, and that's what we're doing. So I'm glad that's okay. And of course, if something came up, we would have to re-budget.
Yeah. Anyone else before we move on?
There's a question from Tom Olson in the chat. If we don't have any easements, do we need terra firma?
So that's a good question, Tom. The terra firma is open to insure your fee properties as well as your conservation easements. And again, this would go to, you know, potential claims against title, or, you know, anytime that you had to go to court to enforce, you know, where there was like a trespass or some other violation on your fee property. You can enroll in terra firma for just your fee property. So if you have no easements, it's totally, entirely possible to enroll your fee properties. And organizations that have both easements and fees can choose to either enroll their easements or just their fee properties, or all of them together. So, you know, and I guess as your risk management instructor, you know, I would point out that, I mean, it's not necessary at all to purchase conservation defense insurance. It's just a good idea because it is one of those areas where, you know, you really have not a ton of control over the risk. I mean, you're doing all the things that you should, like regularly monitoring your easements, and your fee properties. Sorry, I know we're just talking about fee properties here, but you can't control what other parties might do in all cases and situations. And so particularly, you know, in the case where, you know, there may be some uncertainties on title for properties that are old, or, you know, places where, you know, title insurance or title wasn't sufficiently investigated at the time of accepting the property, it could be a really good idea to purchase insurance through terra firma. Okay, anything else before we go? All right, then let's press on. All right, the next slide is about monitoring. I got a lot to say here, so we're going to spend a bit on this. An absolutely essential risk management strategy for stewardship is periodic monitoring of your properties. You won't discover problems without taking a good look around, so that's kind of obvious. Monitoring should be done at least annually, and more often if there's activity on a property that warrants more frequent checking. Monitoring can be a bit different depending on whether the property is a fee property or an easement property. On fee properties, you would be monitoring the condition of the conservation values on the property for management needs, and consistent with the management plan, also be looking for any issues of enforcement. You'd be monitoring for trespass, issues that interfere with your ownership interest. So for example, on a property with trails, you'd monitor the parking area, the kiosks, the trail markers, the trail conditions for needed maintenance, as well as monitoring sites where you've protected or restored habitat, for example, as well as monitoring the boundaries of the property and any place where you've experienced issues before, like roadside dumping, as an example. For easements, you'd also be monitoring the boundaries, but you'll be specifically looking for activity that is inconsistent with the permitted uses or the reserved rights and in violation of specific restrictions in the easement agreement. So you might be looking harder at specific portions of the property, but you wouldn't be looking at it with the eye of that property manager. You would really be very closely keyed to the, you know, the stipulations in the easement agreement. Monitoring should happen at about the same time each year to allow for easier comparison year over year. And monitoring reports should be kept permanently as part of that record set that we talked about last time, even in years where no problems were observed. The reports really serve as your evidence that you're aware of the conditions, that you're upholding your responsibilities and checking periodically on the properties that you protect. In order to do good monitoring, you need complete documentation of what's come before. So in the case of easements, the main source of information is going to be the baseline documentation report, which provides a snapshot of the conditions on the land at the time that the easement was granted. Or in the case of many land trusts' older easements, it might be a snapshot at a later point of time describing the current conditions of the property. So we call those current conditions reports. You might have heard that. BDRs are carefully aligned with the easement document, providing text descriptions, photos, and maps of the various provisions in the easements. And BDRs are signed by both the land trust and the landowner, showing agreement. Basically, you know, both of those parties agree with the contents that are in the baseline. Really helps with monitoring because it gives you an outline of some of the things that you should be looking at, and the maps will help to guide your monitoring route each and every year. For fee properties, the counterpart to the BDR is a management plan, and these are not the same as baselines. You know, baseline documentations are also considered, baseline documentation reports are also risk management strategies to provide evidence in case there's a litigation, right? So they are constructed in such a way so that they can be admitted into evidence in a court of law. So management plans are a little different than that. They can change over time. They are really for the purpose of the landowner, which is you, but they should set forth the organization's goals with respect to the property, and in this way they provide guidance in a monitoring visit. Just a note on who does the monitoring. In Connecticut, where there are many all-volunteer land trusts, it's not unusual at all to have volunteers conduct the monitoring. And this can be really effective, providing that the organization ensures that its volunteers have the information that they need, right? So the baseline documentation report, the management plan for a fee property, you know, past monitoring reports, surveys, things like that. And also that those volunteers are well trained and supervised in their work. So, and this goes for staff as well. Staff who conduct monitoring should be trained and supervised in the way that they carry out that monitoring. Monitoring reports for the year should be reviewed by the appropriate committee or person in the organization who is able to then direct any follow-up that is needed. And finally, a note on remote monitoring, which is becoming more and more possible as technology and the availability of aerial imagery both advance. Remote monitoring, which can be done with a drone, a plane sometimes, or simply with aerial photography that is sourced and almost done in kind of like an armchair traveler way. Really, basically anything that is not done like out there on the property, on the ground. That remote monitoring is a good way of easily scouting for changes and effectively, efficiently honing in on properties that might need a closer look. And standards and practices, best practices, industry standards currently suggest that properties can be remote monitored so long as they're monitored on the ground at least every 5 years, right? Moreover, the Alliance is actively developing resources to help land trusts do this, as well as programming. And they recently hired one of our own, Kate Losey, who was formerly at Northwest Connecticut Land Conservancy, to help to promote that program. So it's been a little difficult to, you know, to be able to rely on updated aerial imagery, especially for me in Northwest Connecticut, but it's better and better all of the time. And I think in the years to come, we will be using this tool quite a bit. Okay. I have a couple of slides. You know, these slides I think are going to bring up issues, but I didn't know what you all were going to want to talk about the most. And so we could easily spend like a whole hour on all of these things, but I figured I'd whip through them and then, you know, give you lots of time for questions so that we can really focus in on the places where, you know, where you have the most uncertainty or where you're, you know, encountering some issues. So in terms of management interventions, there are really countless risks that are associated with the stewardship decisions that we make every single day. And keeping up with best practices is essential in a time of constant change. So I've listed just a few kind of flashpoint areas that relate to a lot of our land management of our fee properties. Last week, for example, land trusts in the Woodbury area convened for a lively conversation about whether or not and under what conditions to use herbicides in invasive treatment or on farmland, and whether or not a comprehensive policy could be developed to help guide the decision making here. There's an active discussion going on presently about forestry, how that relates to forever wild forests, so when forest management is helpful versus harmful. Beavers, streamside buffers, and invasive aquatic plants and organisms are areas where we encounter management challenges in our water bodies. And then finally, the extent of public use and the potential for overuse is something that we've seen during the pandemic, but really don't expect to decrease, and actually hope it won't now that people better appreciate outdoor recreation, but certainly that comes with its challenges. And then I have a slide here about when there are issues on our properties. And so our stewardship programs cover what we do when we find problems, including encroachments, violations, trespasses. We might need to consider requests for easement amendments, for example, or perhaps unfixable violations might even require an easement amendment. When things change on the land, such as the exercise of a restricted right, and here I apologize because I really am talking about easements more than others. I think that the issues with easements are can be a lot more problematic than easements than issues on our fee properties. Sorry. But when things change on the land, a baseline documentation report might need to be updated or supplemented. Permanent records should be kept of all landowner notices or requests for approval, and also the documentation as we consider these requests and provide some correspondence in response. And then the final bullet point on here, and again, we can revisit any of these issues depending on where your questions lie, but we are fortunate in Connecticut to have very favorable laws in the event that we do need to go to court to enforce an easement or to protect our property interests. So Connecticut's laws offer quintuple damages in the event of a favorable decision on an easement violation, but they also prevent any easement property or fee property owned by a land trust to be taken in an adverse possession claim. And then the last point that I put on this slide is, of course, that the recreational use statutes really protect us from liability when people get hurt out on our land. All right, so I wanted to take the opportunity now to do our poll number 2 and then to stop for some questions. So which of the following stewardship risk management strategies are you employing in connection with your monitoring and your enforcement? And there are quite a few different strategies here, so we'll give you some time to read through them all. Nice to see that everyone is monitoring their properties. 15 out of 16. Maintaining records of those. Nobody's got an easement amendment policy. I don't know. I know of at least a couple accredited land trusts on this call that should have one. Maybe this is a good time to mention, by the way, that if you haven't already checked it out, CLCC has a new section on its website that provides templates for organizations, and they're specifically keyed to what kind of an organization you are. So you can find a template that has been successfully used by an all-volunteer land trust, by a small land trust with staff, or a larger land trust that's staffed. And so it's really helpful to be able to look at what our peers are doing, in terms of their policies. So check it out when you get a chance. All right, I think we can close the poll and let's stop for a few minutes for questions. And I'm just going to stop sharing so that I can see everyone. Maybe we'll spend about 5 to 10 minutes on questions.
I see you have your hand raised. Do you have another question?
Yes.
Go ahead.
First of all, we do have an amendment policy. I'm sorry, I misanswered that. The use of chemicals, herbicides or pesticides, whatever, can be a very hot topic, particularly among the general public who may or may not know the details of the particular application being debated. My question, though, goes to how common is litigation over the use of chemicals? Is this more of an A risk or more of a B risk? I'm not talking about reputational risk. I'm talking about actual litigation.
Don, I don't know that I have a great answer for that. I mean, I have not heard of that many. I have not heard of litigations against land trusts, but I know that there's substantial litigation against manufacturers of herbicides. Right. And that is what is driving some of the companies to pull their products from the market. So, I don't feel confident in giving an answer to your question as relates, how we might calculate our own risk of being sued for the use of herbicides, but I definitely think that should factor into our decisions on whether or not we use. Anyone else got a question about any of the management interventions that I raised, different ways of monitoring, baseline documentation reports or management plans, what to do when you find issues? Priscilla.
I'll go back to herbicides. What are your thoughts about volunteers using herbicides, and whether you get caught in, you say they are following the label, but how do we know they're following the label, and what tricky spot does that put the land trust in?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And one of the participants in that discussion that I referenced, and you were part of it too, I know, Priscilla. So, one of the participants followed up with an email, later on in the week, saying that she had checked and that a lot of insurance policies would not cover damages from a spill or a release of, a contaminant. So, it seemed like while if staff were applying an herbicide, they might be covered under workman's comp, it could be more difficult for an organization to fully insure itself against claims from volunteers for harm related to herbicide use. And, I think that it's something to discuss with one's insurance agent, but just on, in terms of what the organization itself can control, the consideration would be whether or not to allow volunteers to use herbicides at all. But if the answer were yes, to make sure that you have, adequate supervision, that you provide training, that there are procedures that include use of protective equipment, including gloves and other barriers, that are really pretty strict in terms of how volunteers are meant to use it. You might have, a training program that is a certain amount of hours and results in a certificate that you then have on file so that you know who among your group of volunteers has gone through that program. But I think this is an area that deserves, really careful and thoughtful planning on our part as land trusts.
I would continue on the herbicides with a stewardship question. If we have easements that say no use of herbicides, how do we monitor for that?
That also is a really good question. One of the standards and practices is about drafting easements very carefully so that you know that you are poised to be able to monitor the restrictions therein. So I think that, I think that there is good sense in having a restriction in a conservation easement against using herbicides, depending on the conservation values that you're trying to protect. But I also, would caution against having a restriction that is almost impossible to monitor and where you might find, the landowner in violation and you as an organization, powerless to really do anything about it.
Thank you.
All right, I think, right, so so I just noticed that Kim put in the chat that that it doesn't have to be a volunteer or a staff person who's using an herbicide. And actually, one doesn't have to use any herbicide at all. But there are choices that we need to make, and these are some of the issues that that this conversation turned around and around. I don't think that we ended with like the answer. It's something that we all need to continue to work on. And keep abreast of what the best practices are and what we know about what these substances do. Are there other questions?
Connie, I was just going to note that there's another comment in the chat from Julie at the Branford Land Trust, and she said that on the rare occasions that they do use herbicide, they partner with their town, and then the land trust cuts the invasive, and then a town employee is the one who applies the herbicide. So another potential option for folks.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to reshare my screen and we'll move on to the final part of our discussion tonight, which is about programs. And I put on the title here that we know that that programs, engaging people in programs, really spreads our stewardship word even farther, engages people in our work. And that really doing programs and engaging our stakeholders is something that we consider to be necessary for existence in perpetuity, which we all are. Education of our neighbors, building public support, really helps to make sure that we can do the work that is needed on our preserves. And potentially even, expands to the way that landowners care for their own private lands, our easement landowners, but also just, Johnny Q. Public, who may have land that's not protected yet, but could be, or at least can be treated with best management practices, really amplifying our impact. So over the past years, many land trusts have expanded their programming to reach new audiences. Or enter new markets or areas of work and provide deeper community service to their stakeholders. So for example, here is a photo of a seniors walk that we at the Kent Land Trust sponsored just last week. We've also been working to plan more multi-use trails, improve access to water amenities in our town, and to host outdoor concerts and events on a field near our town center. So our programming is not always related to traditional environmental issues anymore, but rather uses or seeks to use our land in a different way, so long as it's compatible with natural resources. We're not going to, we're not going to host a concert by putting a platform in a vernal pool, for example. Trash collection and removal, porta-johns, short walks on wide paths are some of the things that are kind of newer to us in this business. And groups are thinking more about social justice issues in their communities and about how to make sure that they reach those who have historically been excluded. So I know that we could have a really rich conversation about new programs and new audiences that we're hoping to reach. I thought that we could break it off with a poll and then maybe enter into some discussion and questions around this, some of the newer areas of programming that we may be making forays into. And I'll just share another little anecdote from this seniors walk, which is that we realized after hosting the seniors walk that we need to have 2 routes planned, because some of the seniors who I was walking with, I was the front end and we had another staffer at the back end. The seniors that I was walking with were like, the Energizer bunny. Like they could have, outrun me on the trail. And then, some of the people in the way back were not ready for that rigorous of a walk, but we had only planned 1 route. And so that ended up being a little bit of a problem. And we've done some risk management this week, in order to prevent that from happening next time. So Rebecca, if you would call up the 3rd poll, which is, which of these risk management strategies are you using in connection with your programming? And you can choose as many as apply. And you may have suggestions, for me, because a lot of this is brand new to me as well, where you can post in chat things that you have discovered are good strategies for, mitigating risks and being able to take advantage of opportunities that reaching new audiences has opened up for us. And thanks to Jen, who shared the link to the recent publication of the Disability Inclusion Guide for Land Trusts, which was developed by the Land Trust Alliance Advisory Council on Inclusive Health and Disabilities. And I used that publication, Jen, to help to write a grant application. So fingers crossed, but I found it really, really helpful. And thanks to the Alliance for doing that. Great. Well, I think that people are just finishing up reading through the different strategies. And very few on we create a plan to address safety needs and supervision. And personally, I think it would be really helpful if there were like a punch list that we could adopt, to use when we're running different kinds of programs, to make sure that we consider all of the things that we should be considering to prevent, prevent some dicey situations while we're conducting the program. All right, great. Well, I am going to stop sharing again so that I can see all of you. And why don't we close up the poll? And does anyone have questions about, new programs that they might be developing, different ways that they might want to think about risks and how to mitigate them, things that they might be considering, but they're not really sure, if it's a good idea or not, or how to make it a better idea? Tim.
Yeah, hi. We've recently been using Eagle Scout projects on some of our land trusts to get some work done, and it's been a win-win for both organizations. But my concern is, a lot of these projects involve using tools and young teenagers, and I'm just wondering if somebody were to get hurt, like somebody was swinging a pick or something and hit somebody, and what's the liability there?
So I think it's likely that your general liability would come into play there, but I also, it's something that you might want to check to make sure that the Boy Scouts have their own liability coverage, which I would suspect that they do. The other thing that I believe about Eagle Scout projects is that it's not the land trust's responsibility to be, training, directing, or supervising the scouts in the execution of their project. And so, if you are concerned at all about reputational risks, it may behoove you to check that out with the scout leader and see, what they have in place in terms of making sure that the scouts are supervised and do a good job. But I don't think that it would be, your role as a land trust to be providing that supervision. I suppose that you might want to make sure if, things like bridges are being built, that you are satisfied that they would be built in a way that is sturdy and lasting and, would, not be a liability for users of a trail. And so, your own responsibility may go a little farther in that situation if the scouts are creating something that, that goes on and is continued to be used by the people that you're welcoming onto your preserve. So those are just the thoughts that are occurring to me top of mind.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Anyone else? Questions? Priscilla, do you have a new question? You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Not a question, just another comment on Eagle Scouts. We've recently started requiring the Eagle Scouts to bring their project to the Land Management Committee and present it. And the Land Management Committee has to agree, yeah, we think this is okay. And yes, we, for that bridge or whatever, we agree with the structure you're creating. And we have to sign off on it in Land Management before the Eagle Scout can do it. Maybe that's a helpful thing to do.
Thanks. That sounds like a good strategy.
Connie, I did get a direct message asking, so the Yukon Extension does chainsaw safety classes on occasion, and the question is if those trainings would be helpful.
Has anyone on this call ever participated in those trainings?
Yes, I have.
Tim, you have?
Yeah, but it was through Connecticut trails. I can't think of the name right now. The trail system, Quinnipiac Blue Trails. And so, yeah, it was through that. But we also, in the land trust, we just started a chainsaw policy that only people who have been trained can use them on the properties. And we have to wear all the safety gear and all that.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Well, it's good to know that you participated in that, I think it sounds like it could certainly be useful, and it would reassure me for sure if I knew somebody who was going to operate a chainsaw had been trained. But I think that the additional policies that you put in place, again, just kind of the layering of different strategies to really reduce risk is a good idea.
Yes. Yeah, and the training was game of logging. It was a national organization.
Great. All right, we are at 2 minutes of. So I just wanted to share my very last slide, which is a reminder that we have one more session, and that next week we're going to be, I don't know. I mean, to the extent that you think like, okay, I kind of get what we're talking about, but I'm still a little fuzzy on how you actually do the risk management assessment. We're going to take a look at the tool, the risk assessment tool. Take a look at the steps that you would pursue if you were going to do it on your own. And I also wanted to, at this time, remind you that the applications for the one-on-one consultant support, so we could talk about this, for the hour that we could, are open and will be open and due, they'll be open until November 30th and are due then. I would encourage you, if you're thinking about applying for the one-on-one support, or if you're going to go it on your own and do the assessment tool internally at your organization, to have your entire team attend next Monday. We have one more poll. And if Rebecca, you would bring it up now. We're just kind of curious. I mean, is your appetite wet for this? Do you want to continue the conversation? We don't know if we could fit every single group that's attended these calls in, but we really think it would be terrific if we could serve everyone who applies. So hope you're thinking about it. And are there any questions about that? I do have the slides from last week available if we wanted to take a look at them, in terms of what the requirements are, the timeline, et cetera, et cetera.
If anyone does have questions about the requirements and they want to reach out, I'm just going to put my email in the chat as well. To reach out directly. Like, there were a couple folks who were looking for some more info on that opportunity, so let's connect.
Jen, do you want to take a look at these slides just quickly, or?
Sure, and there's also a question if we can get the slides or a recording. We do have those, so I think we'll be circulating them shortly. And yeah, I guess we can Rebecca just put a link to the information on the one-on-one support, but it's an opportunity to continue working with Connie, really drilling down for your organization. To do an organizational risk assessment. We'll have 10 hours of time for you to meet with Connie, 8 hours leading up to an assessment report that's provided to you with some long and short-term risk balancing activities, sort of a prioritized list. And then you'll have 2 hours to meet with her after to discuss implementation. So it's over $1,500 worth of consultant support, and we're offering it at a reduced price because of the support that we have from the PCLB Foundation at $300 for a member or $500 for a non-member. And then as part of that, you'll have access to a number of resources as well. So Rebecca just noted in the chat that she'll get those resources in terms of the recording and the slides from our last week's presentation and from this one in an email as soon as they're ready. So stay tuned on that. And if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out. Anything you want to add, Connie?
No, I think that's it. I'm again going to stop sharing just so I can see everyone's face again. And if there are no further questions tonight, I think that we will end for tonight and look forward to seeing you next Monday. And thanks very much for a really engaging conversation this evening.